to have traffic circles. They're very scary. It's, oh, let's all join hands and come into the circle like hippies. Wrong. You come to a four-way stop like a man and you take your territory if you can handle it. If you can't, you get spit to the side and you're out. You lose. You're a loser. And that's what I wanted to make very clear at this time. Thank you very much for your attention. That's all. Go away.
Traffic circles. I think President Trump is onto something. Somebody really ought to tackle those traffic circles. Hello, my friends. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. On today's issue of Jimmy at the Crossroads, I'm going to talk about Liz Cheney and why the House Republicans were well within their rights to remove her as number 3 in the caucus. Then, should a visiting scholar at the University of Colorado have been demoted for speaking at the January 6th rally that happened before and during the beginning of the incursion, the riot at the U.S. Capitol? We're going to talk with a professor who was exactly demoted by the University of Colorado for that event and for being President Trump's one of his attorneys in those election legal battles. Dr. John Eastman will join me along with his attorney, Randy Corporon, as we discuss this important question about freedom of speech on college campuses, intersecting cancel culture and the election controversies. Then our esteemed panel will join us. Today's Crossroads panel is going to be focusing on election integrity efforts across the country in Georgia, Florida, Arizona, and elsewhere. We've got former Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell back on the show. We'll be rejoined by Matt Crane, who's now the executive director of the Colorado County Clerks Association, and Garrett Bess, VP at Heritage Action for America. They will all join us to break that down. We've got a lot happening today on Jimmy at the Crossroads, and we're getting started right now. Finally.
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends. Welcome to Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, coming to you again in partnership with the Washington Examiner. Such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today, as always, here on the show that makes sense out of nonsense. And we have indeed a fascinating show for you, and I want to get right into it. But first, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads, if you have not done so already. And please follow our friends at the Washington Examiner at washingtonexaminer.com. So great to be with you today. We're also about to launch a standalone Jimmy at the Crossroads podcast. If you haven't subscribed yet on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts, please go ahead and do so. We're cooking up some really great topics and guests for the Jimmy at the Crossroads podcast. All right, I want to get right into it before we bring on our guest conversations today. Liz Cheney has been removed as number 3 in the House Republican caucus. She, of course, is the sole representative for Wyoming. And Republicans haven't been too pleased with her, but not for the reasons that the media has been trying to present. And that's what makes this particularly interesting. So she was removed last week. I think the vote was Wednesday or Thursday. And then on Friday, Elise Stefanik, the 36-year-old congresswoman from upstate New York, became the number 3. She was voted in as the 3rd ranking Republican in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, both of these ladies were on Sunday shows yesterday, along with a couple other members of the House of Representatives on the Republican side. And I want to start today by playing a montage of 4 individuals: Liz Cheney, Congresswoman Stefanik, Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, and Congressman Dan Crenshaw of Texas.
We cannot do that if we are embracing the big lie, if we are embracing what President Trump, former President Trump, continues to say on a nearly daily basis, which is claims that the election was stolen, using the same language he used that he knows provoked violence on January 6th. In order for us to be in the strongest possible position to be able to prevail, to be able to defeat the ideas that we see coming from the other side that are really bad for the country, we have to be a party that's based on a foundation of truth.
She is looking backwards. Republicans are looking forward. We are unified, and we are talking about conservative principles. President Trump is an important voice in the Republican Party. We are working as one team, and voters across America, certainly voters in my district in upstate New York, we believe that President Trump's results, whether it was the economic growth, whether it was the historic accords in the Middle East, whether it was being tough on China or the bipartisan coronavirus relief packages, these were significant results that helped everyday Americans. We are focused on moving forward, but also the stakes are so high. Look at how radical Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi's policies have been.
You cannot, on the one hand, say that Donald Trump is a leader or the leader of the Republican Party, which I believe he is the leader of the Republican Party right now, because Kevin McCarthy gave him his leadership card. You can't say he's the leader and then say we have to move on. I would love to move on, Chuck, but listen, when Liz Cheney, probably on a total of maybe 4 or 5 times, just simply answered questions that the election wasn't stolen, and then Donald Trump dozens and dozens of times says it is, it's not Liz's fault.
And I'm going to agree where I agree, and I'm going to disagree where I disagree, and I refuse to allow this drama to engulf us. That's what Kevin McCarthy was saying. I fully agree with that, and there's no point in relitigating some of these things. Look, I say this to Liz, and I say this to Adam, you're not going to get the colleagues who believe in that stuff to apologize to you, to agree with you.
So the narrative has been that the Republicans in the House decided to remove Liz Cheney specifically because she was condemning the idea of stop the steal and the idea that the election was stolen. Now, I don't think that the election was stolen. However, that's not the issue that actually is animating most members of the Republican caucus. What's animating the Republican caucus here is the fact that Liz Cheney is not doing her job. She has been, or had been, as the number 3, the Republican caucus chair. She had been constantly talking about this issue and acting in a divisive way when she's supposed to be bringing the caucus together. She's supposed to be uniting members of her caucus in common cause, in an effort in particular to go against and challenge Donald Trump's replacement, or the next guy in line, that is the current president, Joe Biden. Her role, her specific responsibility is to rally the troops in an effort to combat against the radical left-wing agenda. And she has been failing in that particular endeavor, not actually unifying the troops, so to speak. The editor-in-chief at the Washington Examiner, Hugo Gurdon, recently wrote a column that I found very interesting and I think laid out a lot of these concerns pretty darn well. And here's a little excerpt of that. Let's put it up on the screen here. Most congressional Republicans don't want Trump back. They want him to fade away, right or wrong. They think the party will have a better chance of winning in the future if it can move beyond Trump without alienating his supporters. Recipients should always ask, cui bono? Who stands to gain? And it's not difficult to answer the question in that case. For those who ostensibly want to guide the GOP to a better path, offer precisely the same advice about denouncing Trump as do Democrats who want Republicans to fail. Look, I'm a Trump advocate. I supported his re-election bid. this is a matter in the Republican caucus of leadership, of cohesion, and whether Republicans want Trump involved in the party or not, they want to be able to focus on the agenda at hand. And Liz Cheney has been a distraction in that regard. A previous guest on this show, Keith Nobles, I think put it very well. He said that Liz Cheney wants people to believe she is getting fired for a reason that is not the actual reason she is getting fired, goes to the very core of why Liz Cheney got fired. The job Liz Cheney had was to bring unity to the caucus, promote the success of the caucus, find consensus in the caucus. She did none of that. In fact, it is quite arguable that she made every effort to destroy that and prevent it from occurring. And that's how you get Elise Stefanik as the new number 3 in the Republican caucus. Because Liz Cheney didn't have her eye on the ball of unity, of combating the Biden agenda, the radical left agenda that we see in Congress right now. It's not about whether she supported one idea of elections or another. It's not about the viewpoint there. It's that she's constantly drilling that in, and she's focused on a man who's no longer in office as president of the United States, Donald Trump. So regardless of where the Republican caucus is on President Trump, their goal right now is to combat Joe Biden. And that is not what Liz Cheney was trying to do. And that is the real reason that she was removed, not because she doesn't believe that the election was stolen or that there was widespread voter fraud and other things along those lines. That's the fact of the matter, no matter where you come down on the election stuff. Now, we're going to take a break here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. When we come back, my interview recorded just a little while ago with Dr. John Eastman and Randy Corporon. And I wanted to have this conversation because it deals with what's happening on college campuses in terms of cancel culture and whether or not we can discuss ideas and have conversations on things that are controversial, especially when you have a guy at a campus like University of Colorado as a visiting scholar who was one of President Trump's attorneys in the election fight. To me, it's not about that. Like I said, I believe Joe Biden is the legitimate president and that the election was not stolen, although that is not the same as there were not issues in the 2020 election that need to be addressed and redressed. The issue here, though, is about freedom of speech and whether or not you're able to talk about these topics that are seminal in our moment. I don't care where you come down on this. That's the question here. That's why we got Dr. John Eastman and Randy Corporon coming up here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Stay tuned.
And now, the further future adventures of Starship Winkler.
Thanks for coming to this medical convention with me, Captain. You're a true friend.
You promised there'd be green women.
Well, I'd like you to meet some of my colleagues. This is Dr. Scholes, podiatrist.
How do you do?
And this is Dr. Pepper.
Gesundheit.
Oh, and here comes Dr. Phil. He's a psychiatrist.
Well, every pancake has two sides. And
You're right, Doc. He is boring.
I'm right here.
And this is Dr. Spock, child psychologist.
Goodgy.
And of course, this is Dr. Octopus.
Oh, hello. How do you do?
How do you do?
How do you do? Hi, give me 5. Pleased to meet you. Give me 5. How do you do? So, Doc Ock, what's your field?
I am a proctologist.
Oh, I wish I hadn't shaken all 8 hands.
Well, did the captain bring enough hand sanitizer? Tune in next time when we hear...
And this is Dr. Quinn, medicine woman.
Finally, a woman.
Hey, how are ya? Hey, how are ya? Hey, how are ya?
Ugh.
On Starship Winkler.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Ladies and gentlemen, it's now time for the Crossroads interview with your host, Jimmy Sengenberger, Dr. John Eastman, and Randy Corporon.
Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Jimmy at the Crossroads. So great to be with you today, again in partnership with the Washington Examiner. Such a pleasure and a privilege to have you along for the ride today. My Ask This segment, if you have not done so already, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy at the Crossroads, as well as the Washington Examiner's channel, youtube.com/Washington Examiner. You can keep tabs on all the great content that we've got cooking up for you today. In the next segment, we're going to have our panel on election integrity efforts in various states across the country. And I thought it would be pretty apropos for a lead-in that covers two different distinct areas. One is concern over the 2020 elections. The other, I think especially pronounced here, is the idea and the concern about cancel culture in academia and elsewhere. I've got two guests today that I'm very pleased to introduce in a moment. One of them spoke at the rally on January 6th that happened at about the same time as the incursion on the U.S. Capitol was happening. A few weeks later, this guest, Dr. John Eastman, went on CNN to talk about his experience and give his thoughts on what happened. Here's a little taste of his speech and that exchange with Michael Smerconish from CNN.
We no longer live in a self-governing republic if we can't get the answer to this question. This is bigger than President Trump. It is the very essence of our Republican form of government, and it has to be done. And anybody that is not willing to stand up to do it does not deserve to be in the office. It is that simple.
What responsibility are you prepared to take for those words as being incitement to that crowd?
They don't even get close to incitement to that crowd. The standards set out by the Supreme Court in Brandenburg versus Ohio is not remotely close to what I said. And let's put that statement in context. We're talking about asking the vice president to delay the proceedings enough to exceed the requests from hundreds of state legislatures who had notified him that their electoral votes had been certified in violation of state law, and to give those legislatures a few days, now that they were back in session, to review the illegality that had occurred and to determine whether it had an effect on the election.
Sort of makes you think, where did the time go? It's like a year ago or ages ago that happened. Time flies so fast in this era of media and everything. But that speech at the Capitol was used as the pretense, at the very least, for the University of Colorado to demote, suppress, how would you define it, Dr. John Eastman, who was the visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at the Bruce D. Benson Center for Western Civilization at the University of Colorado. And I am so pleased today to be joined to talk about what's going on here by Dr. John Eastman, law professor, and his attorney, Randy Corporon, also radio host on 710 KNUS. We both share Saturdays on KNUS. And in full disclosure, because we are talking about a law thing, Randy gave me my first job at his law firm out of college, although it's been a few years since I last worked there. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Thank you very much, Jimmy, for having me on the program.
Thank you, Jimmy. I'm starting to get over those several years at the law firm with you.
It takes a long time to get past the aura of Jimmy Sengenberger working for anybody. I know, it's incredible.
You did a great job.
Thank you. Well, Randy, it is great to have you back on. You were here last July when we had that pro-police rally, Colorado. That's another discussion for another day, but I do want to remind folks that you've been on the show before, and it's great to have you back on. So I want to break down some of the facts here and get to the basics of the matter. First with Dr. John Eastman, as far as how things developed, how you got the role at the University of Colorado as a visiting scholar for the 2020-2021 year. And then we'll go to Randy afterwards for a discussion a little bit more, and of course, John, on the topic of the legal case, because you've sent a notice of claim, getting ready to file a claim. Professor Eastman, how did you find yourself working at the University of Colorado as a visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at the Center for Western Civilization?
Well, a number of the former visiting scholars had suggested I apply for it. The job application says they're seeking somebody who's with national profile in the conservative thought, scholarship, or practice of conservative policy. And so I announced in my job application that, my scholarship on birthright citizenship, on constitutional federalism and separation of powers, it was not only, among the leading scholarship in the area, but also was having real world implications in revisions of Supreme Court precedent, and looking back at and reviewing reviewing our understanding of the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment. So I said this job was perfect for me. They agreed. They had me out and gave a job talk on birthright citizenship. And then they offered me the position. And when I was asked by Newsweek in August of last year to apply my longstanding scholarship on citizenship to Kamala Harris, all hell broke loose. They started at that point looking for a way to fire me, but didn't. And then when I represented President Trump before the Supreme Court, they started a renewed effort looking for ways to fire me. And then when I gave the speech on January 6th, they canceled all my classes, and then within a week they had prohibited me from engaging in all my other duties on campus. Now, I just got to point out how ludicrous the claim is, that same one on the CNN clip you played earlier, that my little 3-minute speech an hour before the president's incited people to leave the White House and the mall in front of the White House and go down and cause an insurrection at the Capitol. 500,000 people who had flown in from all over the country to hear the president speak were so incited by my talk that they left without hearing the main event. I mean, it's laughable, these claims that the university made, and yet there we are.
Now, a moment ago, Dr. John Eastman, I showed the clip, and let's put it up again, from 2019 when you spoke on this issue of birthright citizenship at the University of Colorado before you were offered the position. And I wanted to show this because in that August article that you wrote, the controversial piece for Newsweek, where you raised questions about now Vice President Kamala Harris, then the nominee to be Vice President of the United States, you gave this talk well before then. Talk to us about that relative to your position and the things that came about after that 2020 article.
Well, one of the things that I was accused of is making up this new theory because I was racist, because Kamala Harris's parents were from India and Jamaica, and therefore she's a woman of color, and I only made this theory up because I'm racist. This was one of the false defamatory claims that were made against me. The fact that I had been doing this scholarship for 20 years was known to some of the people that made that claim, because they were the ones that reviewed my job application, and they were the ones that were present in the room when I gave the talk a year earlier. So it's just false. And by the way, the standard for defamation in the United States is very high hurdle. If you're a public figure, you got to prove not only was it false and knowingly false, but maliciously false. But I got a similar defamatory note copied to the president of my home university, Chapman University, claiming that I was a racist because of this position. He was from the London School of Economics, and I pointed out that the First Amendment law on defamation is more favorable for the victim of defamation there. And within the return email, I had an apology from him, acknowledging that, in fact, it was false. But in America, the standard for defamation is a little higher, so people are able to say defamatory things almost with complete immunity and impunity.
Dr. Eastman, I have one more question for you before we shift gears and talk a little bit more about the specifics of the legal matter. In terms of the timeline, when did you find out that you weren't going to be teaching classes and figure that out? And how did that tie in with the events at the Capitol? And also, if you could dovetail that in with what happened at Chapman University, where you agreed to resign following the January 6th events.
Right. So I spoke on January 6th. That afternoon or evening, I'm trying to know, the next day, January 7th, the chancellor of the University of Colorado sent around a defamatory note campus-wide to the press, to the alumni of University of Colorado, claiming that, calling my statements on the 6th repugnant because I had no foundation for them. Now, he had never reached out to me to say, what kind of evidence do you have to support the things you've said? I said election officials in a number of the states ignored or violated their state laws, election laws. That's demonstrably true. I said we've got dead people voting, and I've got sworn affidavits in Georgia and Nevada and elsewhere confirming that by expert analysis. And then I said the audit in Michigan had indicated that the machines can store ballots. I call them a secret folder. The actual manual calls them a suspense folder. Those ballots can be uploaded and stored and then utilized as necessary. And that my expert team had seen it happening live on the Senate runoff in Georgia. So those were the three things I said. The chancellor didn't bother to reach out to me and ask if I had any evidence to support it. He just said that I had no evidence. That was at least negligently false. I then immediately sent a note to the head of the Benson Center, who's my titular boss. And I said, I want you to know I've got sworn testimony for every statement I made or expert reports. And he then sent out a note campus-wide saying that I did all of this stuff without any evidence. So that was no longer negligently false. It was knowingly false. But he also said that he was going to cancel my classes and shift everybody into independent study, which was unfortunate, but the students and I could make do. The day before classes started the following week, though, I'm locked out of the class system altogether, and the provost sends me a letter saying, we have canceled all of your classes for under-enrollment, they claim. And that's significant because there were 120 other classes offered this past semester, same semester, in the same College of Arts and Sciences, lectures and seminars, not specialty labs or externships or anything like that. 120 classes with enrollments at or below my enrollment. And so it's completely pretext. And what that means is they retaliated against me by suspending me from my duties. That's an adverse employment action. Albeit with pay, but they suspended me. That's an adverse employment action in retaliation for my representation of the President of the United States. It's stunning.
Dr. John Eastman, can you just tell us, since you said that the university didn't ask you for any sort of evidence, what kind of evidence do you have that would have been presentable to the university had they asked?
Well, and we had a press conference on April 29th when we announced my legal team was filing a notice of claim, and we put a press pack together that included the links to the evidence that we had at the time. It's gotten much bigger than that, but at the time, I have a litany of laws in Pennsylvania and elsewhere in the country that were violated by state election officials in violation of Article 2 of the Constitution. That was in my Supreme Court briefs in both the Texas case and the Pennsylvania case when I was representing President Trump. I had the expert reports in Georgia and in Nevada where they had analyzed how many voters were on the Social Security Death Index. And in Nevada, the claim there was under oath was 1,506 dead voters. And then we've got sworn affidavits by experts in Georgia and in Michigan dealing with the machine issues. So all of that was available had anybody asked. And of course, that was way back in January. We're 4 months later now, and the evidence just keeps mounting of the illegality, and the statistical disparities that are just beyond nature to have happened.
Dr. Eastman, your tenure ended on May 7th. Was that when your contract was up? Do I
That's when my contract was up.
Okay, so that's why you're now a former visiting scholar. But until that point, you were unable to teach your classes, access Westlaw, and so forth. I want to put up, as we switch over to Randy Corporon, attorney at the law offices of Randy Corporon, I want to put up an image here that showcases some of what the University of Colorado said in a Denver Post article on April 29th. Put it up. Consistent with First Amendment principles in the university's policies, Professor Eastman is able to speak on any subject he wishes and pursue his scholarship, CU Boulder spokesman Andrew Sorensen said. The university has taken no action that would deter a reasonable person from engaging in free speech. The university, however, is not constitutionally obligated to have him serve in any representational capacity when he exercises his right to free speech. Professor Eastman was not suspended. The College of Arts and Sciences canceled his spring courses for low enrollment in accordance with its policies. Provost Russell Moore appropriately relieved him from performing outreach functions on behalf of the Benson Center because his continued performance of those duties would likely cause disruption and harm to the center. Randy Corporon, what is your response to that, and what is the notice of claim that you sent entail, and to whom did you send it?
Sure, Jimmy, and I just want people who are new to this story to think about the scope of what we're talking about here. One of the premier universities in the world has one of the premier constitutional scholars in the world on their staff as a visiting scholar who represented the President of the United States, is in the midst of one of the most important controversies in American history. And rather than hear him out, rather than discuss or get into open forums and let the students hear and learn and participate in sorting through what's true and what isn't, they canceled him. The response that they put into the Denver Post, some of that will have to come out in court. But the idea that there wasn't retaliation, the idea that they provided any due process at all, constitutional or procedural or otherwise, to Dr. Eastman is pretty easy to disprove. And so the fact that they paid him his salary seems to be the thing that they're going to hang their hat on when we get to our lawsuit. But it's going to be very, very interesting for them to explain why they cut him off from his legal research funds and why they refused to let him share his opinion in any fashion related to the University of Colorado or the center. With regard to our suit, in Colorado, you have to provide 90 days of notice to any state entity like a hospital or a police department, or in this case, the University of Colorado, a state university, prior to actually initiating the lawsuit. So we provided that notice on April 29th. And now CU has 90 days to ignore us, to respond to us, to talk with us if there's maybe a possibility of resolving these claims. And once that 90 days is up, I think that's July 29th, then we're free to move forward on our lawsuit. And I can certainly go into some of the details of our claims if that's what you'd like me to do next.
Yeah, I understand that. It seems like from reading the notice of claim that there are two legs to it. One is the defamation piece, and that's where most of the monetary damages come from. And then the other addresses the contractual issue in terms of him being denied the ability to do his classes, to access Westlaw services, and so forth. So briefly, just touch on those two legs.
Well, I don't know that I'd agree with you that defamation is the majority of damages. These constitutional violations are significant and severe. And the only way to stop that kind of behavior from an institution like CU in the future is to force them to write a big check. The claims that we're bringing include defamation, of course, but also have other very serious claims: breach of implied duty of good faith and fair dealing, retaliation in response to constitutionally protected speech and acts, violation of administrative and constitutionally protected due process, violation of their own policies. Jimmy, I should have sent you a link to the University of Colorado website that talks about what a safe place they are to have open debate and free speech. Yeah, you got it. I didn't need to send it to you. Freedom of expression by University of Colorado faculty. When engaged in teaching and research, faculty enjoy the associated rights and observe the associated responsibilities of academic freedom as expressed in Regent policy. And if people read that second paragraph, man, oh man, I look forward to seeing how CU defends themselves against canceling Dr. Eastman in the middle of his tenure as a visiting scholar.
Well, and let me add, look, they have a prohibition on university policy against discrimination on the basis of, among other things, political affiliation and political philosophy. And they've been very proud of that. In fact, they get, green status with with the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. That's the high level for diversity of opinion and thought. One of the very reasons the Benson Center exists is to provide a counter viewpoint. But there is no question that they took these actions against me in retaliation for my political expression and my political representation. And let me, I'm one of the leading scholars in the country on the question of birthright citizenship. One of the key scholars in the country on the question of separation of powers and the relative role of the federal government versus the states. They tapped my expertise and my significant network of colleagues around the country to organize a lecture series, and then they barred me from introducing the lecturers that were only coming because of my connection with them. I mean, the notion that this wasn't retaliation is pretty preposterous.
So let me ask you this question, Dr. Eastman, and also Randy, feel free to jump in on this too. Do you think that they fired you because of what you said and they just disagreed with it, or because they believed that you were perpetrating falsehoods?
Well, it doesn't matter. Under First Amendment right, look, the way the Supreme Court has set out First Amendment rights, the idea of protecting even false speech is because in the crucible of speech, you get to the truth. Maybe everything I said was false, but how are we going to know that if nobody's allowed to contest it? If I'm not allowed to rebut their opposition, whether in an adjudicative process, adversarial process in court, or in an academic setting with an adversarial process or point and counterpoint, that's how we get to the truth, through the crucible of that mix-up in speech. And to shut down one side of the speech is almost a guarantee we're never going to get to the truth. And one suspects at some point that they fear what the truth actually is. Look, if I were Joe Biden, and I said this way back in December, I'd be the first one out there calling for full forensic audits of the election. Because if I won, I want the American people to know that, instead of being under this dark cloud that the election was stolen. And yet you find on his side of the aisle every single effort to shut down subpoenas, to ignore subpoenas that are issued, to bring bar complaints against the lawyers that are representing the cases, to see things like this at University of Colorado shutting down my speech. Why are they so afraid to hear the evidence or the other side? But the Supreme Court's been very clear.
Sure.
The counter to false speech is more speech. So if indeed what I said was not true, and by the way, it's not, it was true, but if indeed it's not true, the counter to that under the First Amendment is counter speech. We have never had the opportunity for that at the University of Colorado or elsewhere.
Randy Corporon, feel free to piggyback on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely, because, Professor Eastman's right that it doesn't matter for purposes of the lawsuit whether it's true or not. But for purposes of public policy, for purposes of your viewers to understand just how significant what's happening is, this is one side of the political spectrum that has, in concert with mainstream media, local TV stations, national TV, radio, elsewhere, is doing everything in their power to shut down the discussion about investigating the election. Even after spending 4 years claiming collusion for Donald Trump and Russia, that was a story every day for months and months and months. But we can't even investigate what happened in this very significant presidential election. So the idea that a university like CU would make that political conclusion, you cannot doubt the integrity of a man like Professor Eastman, believing sincerely what he is presenting. This is a man who started his career clerking for United States Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who has been dean of law schools and taught many law school courses and been involved in critically important cases. They shut him down because, and you see it everywhere, any news story, it says the unfounded allegations of election fraud. Well, they are founded. They're continuing to be investigated. And these universities and news outlets don't want anything to do with it.
So you and I, Randy, as you know, do have some disagreements on the extent to which there are founded claims in terms of what happened in the election. But what catches my interest here is not that this is so much about the idea of whether or not there were issues with the election and to what extent there were problems and in what ways, but it is that speech aspect here that we are seeing all across the country, as you're alluding to in social media, when it comes to excuse me, when it comes to college campuses and now the military, even with a lieutenant colonel being demoted from the Space Force, in the Space Force, because of something he said about Marxism. We're seeing this all over the place, and that's what particularly catches my interest here. But there is one sort of case study that I'd be curious your thoughts on, Randy Corporon, as the attorney on Dr. Eastman's case, one of the attorneys. And that is the Ward Churchill matter of a number of years ago when I was in high school. He was a professor, tenured professor at the University of Colorado, who was fired and brought suit, and he wasn't successful in that suit. And part of the case was on the issue of defamation, and they said that the university folks, particularly the regents in the administration, the CU Board of Regents that oversees the university, the elected board, had qualified immunity in that regard. Does that apply here? How would you take that Churchill matter of over a decade ago and apply it to this circumstance?
Well, I got to tell you, Jimmy, one of the great honors of being a part of this case is working not only with the team that we're putting together for Dr. Eastman, but working with Dr. Eastman himself. His scholarship on these issues is far better than mine. I'll just turn that question over to him.
Yeah, Jimmy, it's a great question. Look, qualified immunity protects government officials when they are taking actions that are not violating clearly established constitutional rights. It is clearly established beyond peradventure that you cannot retaliate against somebody for their exercise of free speech. The university retaliated against me for my exercise of free speech. In fact, they even admitted in the chancellor's opening salvo, his letter was a response to a faculty petition of nearly 800 other faculty members and graduate students demanding that I be fired. And he said, I can't do that. That would violate his constitutional rights to free speech. And then they did that anyway. I mean, they didn't fire me. They just demoted me or suspended me with pay. But it's still the same adverse employment action. And it's still the same constitutional violation. And the law is clearly established there, which means they don't get qualified immunity.
Although the reason why I raised the question is that Churchill, as I recall, was fired because of speech that he had used.
Well, no, what you know, they wanted to. They didn't fire him for it, but the high profile, the intense scrutiny that speech brought to him, they started looking at his scholarship, and they found lots of evidence of plagiarism in his scholarship.
Oh, that's right.
And he was fired for that. And he had all sorts of hearings. He had all the levels of due process you want, none of which were given to me.
That's a distinction, Randy Corporon, I'd like you to address, which is the idea of due process in this particular matter of Dr. John Eastman and the University of Colorado.
Well, Jimmy, there's hardly any distinction to address at all, because as opposed to the hearings and the appeals that then can come from administrative hearings within the school system, when it came to Professor John Eastman, Dr. John Eastman, the full extent of his due process is, hey, we don't believe you. We're going to tell the world that we don't believe you, that you're spreading unfounded rumors and alleging facts that aren't true, and we're going to interfere in your ability to do your job. There was no hearing. There was no, as you heard Dr. Eastman say at the beginning, he responded immediately to the first email that was sent to him and said, I've got loads of evidence. They didn't want to hear it. So there was no due process afforded that I've been made aware of so far. And we've already got thousands of pages of communications and different things that establish it doesn't even seem like due process was discussed.
We're going to be wrapping up here now with our guests, Dr. John Eastman and attorney Randy Corporon, one of the attorneys representing Dr. Eastman. I do want to throw up Eastman 4, which lays out the damages that you guys are requesting, looking for, hence this notice of claim. And they have, of course, now less than 90 days to respond. But you can see you're looking for nearly $1.9 million in compensatory damages. Randy, can you talk about that breakdown for a moment?
Sure. There was about $20,000 that were provided to Dr. Eastman in what they call a startup research account, which allowed him access to Westlaw and other extensive legal databases. He was precluded from accessing those once they shut him down. The $1.85 million is calculated by taking the 10 years until his retirement age of 70 at the $185,000 contractual salary rate for harm to his reputation. And then that number can go up from there with, of course, interest and punitive damages, which can be significant if a court or jury determines that that his constitutional rights were violated the way that we believe they were. And then in a federal lawsuit like this, the winner can also recover their attorney's fees and their costs, which I expect to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars in this case as well.
Dr. Eastman, a final word from you, sir.
Well, look, I'm in a position to be able to push back against this. Yes, my constitutional rights were violated, and I'd like to vindicate those and restore some semblance of my reputation as a result. But there are a lot of students and junior faculty members on campuses all over the country that are self-censoring themselves for fear that they'll get caught up in the kind of controversy and cancellation that I'm caught up in. And so it's on their behalf that I'm pushing this. But also the students on campus, as Randy mentioned earlier. I mean, I was brought here to provide an alternative voice to campus in both the scholarship and the actual practice of conservative thought. I did that job beyond anyone's imagination. When the President of the United States asked me to represent him, the students should have had an opportunity to hear that. The university could have been the forum where these issues were debated in public that the whole world would watch. And instead they reacted in joining on this cancel culture bandwagon to shut down speech and to prevent access to the truth for the students, for the community, for the state of Colorado, for the country, indeed for the whole world. And I think I'm in a position with this lawsuit to start pushing back against that kind of nonsense.
Jimmy, if I may, very quickly. There was massive cars going by, during the press conference. Vast majority were supporting, honking, shouting. A few detractors, of course, a few expletives, and that sort of thing. But was really significant to me, two different women, one during the press conference, one after, who came up to me and asked, "What is this about?" And I just explained in a very basic way how Dr. Eastman had been precluded from speaking about these very important issues he was involved with. And both of those young ladies, college students at CU, just shook their head. And one of the comments was, "We should always have free speech here on our campus." I think it's a losing issue for CU, and I hope they do something about it very quickly.
We will see what happens, especially once they do respond in whatever way to the notice of claim. And of course, you will be filing. Around what time would you expect to file a lawsuit if they don't say, "Hey, here's an offer" or something to address this?
The earliest we could file is July 29th. I can't see any reason why we would delay beyond that date unless there are some conversations ongoing with CU that are worthy of pursuing before we file in court.
Well, I will be watching this case with great interest because, of course, the University of Colorado is in my home state of Colorado. And, of course, Randy, we are colleagues on the radio, and I know you quite well. We have known each other for over a decade now, which is pretty crazy to think about. And, Professor Eastman, I remember hearing you on Hugh Hewitt's show, and you definitely have been around the block for quite a while in legal matters. So I'm going to be watching this with great interest. I believe that overall, Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States, but there are irregularities, there are issues of concern, and certainly we should have free speech and the ability for individuals like yourself to speak out about topics of interest, of import, especially when you were an attorney representing the president of the United States in election lawsuits. So best of luck to you both, and I appreciate the time today.
Thank you very much, Jimmy.
Hang on to your hat, Jimmy. There's a lot more evidence coming your way. Thanks for your time.
We'll see what happens, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Once again, Dr. John Eastman, former attorney for President Trump in his election lawsuits and former visiting scholar for conservative thought and policy at the Bruce D. Benson Center for Western Civilization at the University of Colorado, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, as well as his attorney, Randy Corporon, also, of course, my colleague at 710 KNUS Radio here in Denver. And let me just say, to me, this isn't an issue about the election and whether it was stolen or not. I don't believe that it was. Certainly, there are things that we need to be looking into to suss out, to address, and there are election integrity efforts. We're going to talk about it with our panel in the next segment that are underway in states across the country to shore up the integrity and security and confidence of our elections. But this isn't about that. This is about freedom of speech. Did the University of Colorado have grounds to strip Dr. Eastman of any of his duties? That's a question that they're going to have to address. And I think it's important to talk about it and to have this situation put out there for discussion, because it's happening all across the country. That's why I wanted to make sure we had Dr. Eastman and Randy Corporon on to tell their side of this important story as we see cancel culture run amok all across the United States of America. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, our Crossroads panel with former Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell, Garrett Bess, Vice President at the organization Heritage Action for America, and Matt Crane, the Executive Director of the Colorado County Clerks Association, will be joining me to talk about those election integrity efforts all across the country. Stay with us. Don't go anywhere. Jimmy at the Crossroads, in partnership with the Washington Examiner, will be back in moments.
Who's there? What do you want?
Hello, Don Trump. It's me, the Easter Bunny.
Have a seat, have a seat, have a seat so much. Do you remember, Easter Bunny, when I did you a huge favor by eliminating those horrible carrot tariffs?
Yeah,
Well, now guess what? You're going to do me a huge favor by doing your normal Easter Bunny thing, whatever that is. Running around the world, planting eggs in the ground, but America first, please.
Okay, a couple of things. First of all, I hop around the world. I don't run. And second of all, I don't plant the eggs. I just hide them.
How do they come to full maturity then?
Well, you hard boil them.
That seems a little cruel to me. I don't,
Well, I'll tell you what you can do. Why don't you just pardon them like you do the Thanksgiving turkeys?
It's a different thing.
The third thing. How am I going to get around the world, Mr. President? The travel ban's in effect. There's TSA to worry about. I mean, I got to get...
Consider it done. Consider it done. I'm going to use the War Appropriations Act to commandeer Santa's sleigh.
Good idea.
And there's nothing he can do about it.
Well, he might not...
Oh, you're worried about his elves.
The elves, yeah.
Believe me, if they raise a stink, it's going to be boom, boom, out go their northern lights, believe me.
Oh, that seems kind of harsh.
Now, tell me something. When you hippity-hop out of your tomb...
that would be Jesus.
Every year. And you see your shadow?
That would be Puxatawny Phil, the gopher.
That means there's 6 more weeks of the quarantine, isn't that right?
That would be Dr. Fauci.
You know something very interesting? The Easter Bunny. Most bunnies leave only white eggs.
There's only me, sir.
And that's wrong. I'm the least eggsist man you'll ever meet. This year we're going to have all the colors of the eggs everywhere, every stripe. A panoply, a panorama, a rainbow of colors.
Yeah.
I want it to look like Walt Disney himself threw up.
Thanks for that visual. I think I can make that happen. Let me call my peeps. We'll get around the world before you know it, and Easter Sunday's going to be great again. Oh, and this year, Mr. President,
yes,
just as a favor, I promise not to smoke all the Easter grass.
That's a very good.
That's a little joke I got from Colorado.
I'm going to tweet that one, actually.
I'm out of here.
I'm tweeting it right now. Here I am. Oh, by the way, when you get to heaven, say hi to Half and the bunnies for me, please.
I really don't think that's the way it works, Don Trump, but I'll see what I can do.
And now, the further future adventures of Starship Winkler. In today's episode, the captain is making travel plans.
Sparks, open up a frequency to price expediosity line.
Yes, Captain.
Hello, and welcome to Price Expediosity Line. How can I help you?
Well, I'll need a room.
Are you traveling alone?
Yes.
Oh, that's a shame. Never found the right woman, huh?
Well, there was this... No, wait, just book me a bed.
King, queen, full, twin, Murphy, or bunk.
King. You never know.
Well, as long as you're convinced. All right, name your price.
Name my price?
That's how it works. Name your
price?
$6?
$6 it is. Let's plug it in here. Bippity boppity boo. And sorry, you are outbid.
By how much?
Penny. Someone bid 6. Oh, 1.
Who?
Oh boy, I just booked a room for $6.01.
Well, will the captain ever make a good bet bid? Tune in next time when we hear...
Here's one for $602.
I'll take it.
$1,000.
Oh, damn dramatic pauses.
On Starship
Winkler.
Do you wear a toupee? Do you yell out, Spock? Do you put in pauses when you talk? Do you start real soft and then go real loud? Have you won 2 Emmys? Do you love a crowd?
Whatever makes you feel like a Shatner. Yeah, you got lots of macho and swagger. You had alien affairs. You sing bad but no one cares. You find low airline fares. If you like to work, got a handsome smirk. If you're Captain Kirk, whatever makes you feel like a...
Me. Phasers are stunning. Whatever makes you feel like a Shatner.
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 Talking politics, great for generations. Oh, what mix! I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics. I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense.
And ladies and gentlemen, it's now time for the panel discussion. Here's your host, Jimmy Sengenberger.
People want answers, they want to understand.
All right, folks, here we are, Jimmy at the Crossroads at last, coming to you in partnership with the Washington Examiner. We have our guests lined up. We've sorted through a little technical issue, and we are revved up and ready to go. Here, once again, on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Such a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today. I hope you found that a very interesting interview with Dr. John Eastman and his attorney, Randy Corporon. Now, we want to talk about the different efforts in various states across the country with regards to enhancing election integrity. It's a very important topic of conversation because, look, as I said before, I don't believe the election was stolen. I believe Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States. But that does not mean, nor is it separate from the idea that there are issues of concern that have happened across this country with regards to the 2020 elections, different processes that were put in place, how vote by mail was done in various states, some voter fraud concerns, so on and so forth. Those two things can be the case, and we need to improve and secure our elections across the country. Colorado, where I live, is a great place when it comes to election integrity overall. There are definitely things to be worked on, but it is a state that for years has already been implementing a vote-by-mail system, going back to 2013. But it's important to keep in mind that it took years to develop to get to the point, as we've talked about on this show before, to get to the point where Colorado could actually make that switch to vote-by-mail, to mail ballot voting, at 100% mail ballot voting system, unless somebody chooses they want to go vote in person. It's not something that can happen overnight like a lot of these states did. You need to make sure that your systems are tightened up. So how can we do that? And what about what states like Georgia and Florida, Arizona and Alabama and others have been doing? Are those the right ways to approach election integrity, or should we be going with the House Democrats want to do, which is H.R. 1 and Senate Resolution 1, an expansive federal government control takeover of our elections? Let's talk about it with today's Crossroads panel, an esteemed group that I am very pleased to welcome to Jimmy at the Crossroads in partnership with the Washington Examiner. In the top right corner, we've got Ken Blackwell, the Honorable Ken Blackwell, who, among other many hats that he has worn, he is the former Secretary of State for Ohio. We also have Matt Crane in the bottom left corner. He is the Executive Director of the Colorado County Clerks Association, and for years was my county clerk. In fact, he was the county clerk for Arapahoe County, Colorado, when we implemented vote by mail in the state. And now he is, as I said, Executive Director of the Colorado County Clerks Association. And in the bottom right corner, we have Garrett Bess, who's the Vice President at Heritage Action for America. And both these gentlemen join me now. Without further ado, welcome to the show. It is so good to have all three of you on. I really appreciate the time today.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy.
Thank you all for coming on. Really appreciate that. So, let's jump right into it. I want to ask a broad question, which is, what do you view, each of you individually, the current state of election integrity in this country right now? And what do we most need to be focused on in terms of improvement? I'll start with you, former Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell.
It's good to be with you, Jimmy. And
good to have you back.
This is a great panel. Look, what we want in our election system are two basic things. We want to be able to make sure that the chain of custody of ballots are tight. We don't want too many hands touching too many ballots. We want a chain of custody that is tight. Secondly, we want a verification system put in place through policies and practices that help us to make sure that a voter is who he or she claims to be. You tighten the chain of custody, you put in verification systems, and you begin to put in place a system that reduces the chances of irregularities and fraud, and you build voter confidence in the result. That's what we want, and we have uneven development across the country, state after state, and that's why you're now seeing states pick up the reform effort to make sure that they have tight chains of custody and verification systems.
All right, and now let's go to Matt Crane. What are your thoughts on where the current state of election integrity is in this state right now, Matt Crane?
So thank you, Jimmy. I think we're in an interesting spot right now. I would say we're Secretary Blackwell was talking about are very important steps. There are other things that we'd like to work on as well, where enhancing what we can audit around election systems, whether it's signature verification or voter registration, making sure that that work is being done properly and accurately. It took Colorado about 20 years to go, well, 15 years to go from where we moved to no excuse absentee voting to where it was all mail ballot delivery. And so I think that, the states that, moved very quickly in 2020 to go to all mail ballot delivery, I think they're behind. And I think there's some things that we can do to help them in terms of their processes and procedures. But I think we'd be remiss if we also didn't say a part of election integrity has to be people speaking truthfully about elections and what happens. The amount of mis and disinformation that we've had from this election cycle has had a really damaging effect. I would say it's been as damaging as any process issues that we've seen in the states. And so I think we really have to focus on what's true and what's not. And there's plenty of good and there's some bad that we have to talk about as well. But I think we have to have honest conversations around elections, and doing those kind of things will help build people's trust in our processes. Secretary Blackwell and I were talking before we came on about public trust in these processes is so important. We see poll after poll that shows people will not participate if they don't trust the process. So we really have to move forward, everybody together the best we can, to improve our integrity and to speak the truth about what really happens. And I think those things will help boost the integrity around our processes.
We are getting some feedback. Not sure where the source is, unfortunately, but I think we'll muddle through it just fine. Garrett Bess, Vice President, Government Relations and Communications at Heritage Action for America. Your brief assessment of the current state of election integrity in America, sir.
Well, thanks for having me on. And, I'd like to just echo a little bit of what Matt just said. If people don't trust their system of self-government and how they go about choosing their elected representatives, then really the way that we govern ourselves in this country is at jeopardy. And so, we've seen some polling data that shows either in the 2016 presidential election or in the most recent 2020 presidential election, significant numbers of Americans believe that one of those two presidential elections was basically either stolen or through fraud the outcome was not trustworthy. And so we have a real responsibility to ensure that Americans understand how they choose their elected officials and that they can trust those systems that they choose those elected officials by. Across the states, many state legislators are tackling this issue, and like both Ken and Matt have both said, every state is a little different. So there's not necessarily a uniform one size fits all federal sort of mandate that should come down to tell states how to run their elections. But there are best practices that states can follow to ensure that their elections in their state, the way that they administer them, the way that their citizens choose their officials, can be trusted. And so, our organization is focused on states that look very much like a battleground map, states like Iowa, Georgia, Florida, Texas, Arizona. But across the country, there's other states, Montana, Arkansas, Tennessee, and others that are tackling this issue in their various ways. And our grassroots, which number almost 2 million across the country, have been heavily in all those efforts. And it's just really heartening to see Americans taking ownership over their form of self-government.
Well, you're getting at something very important, I think, Garrett Bess, and that is the idea of federalism, that elections are done best when states are able to craft their own policies, their own procedures, yes, with best practices, but not with top-down federal government control, which brings us, for example, to H.R. 1, this bill in Congress that the Democrats are trying to get through that would be very much a federal takeover. I want to show pick number 1, panel 1, which is a little excerpt. I'm a columnist at the Denver Gazette, a sister publication here in Colorado to the Washington Examiner, and I'm very concerned about this relative to Colorado. I say, for example, Colorado has made improvements over the years. We still have more to do yet. If H.R. 1 becomes law, we won't be able to make the enhancements. Instead, Congress will tie Colorado's hands, limit our ability to strengthen election integrity, and force a rigid one-size-fits-all approach upon us. In short, H.R. 1 will eradicate Colorado's ability to stay atop other states as the gold standard. Matt Crane, as a former Colorado County clerk and someone who helped oversee the transition to vote by mail in Colorado, where we do have a lot of best practices in place. You know the rough road that it's taken for Colorado to really get things enhanced. I worry about a top-down federal regime that says all states must follow these rules.
Jimmy, that's absolutely right. It's funny, you know, when you hear people talk, proponents of HR 1 talk about it, they say, oh, well, we want to follow great examples like Colorado. But what's in that proposed legislation would hurt the way that Colorado conducts its elections. You know, we've been able to take, as you said, lessons learned and adapt over time to a point where, you know we still have some work to do, but our model's in pretty good shape. I'm a firm believer that, you know, the states should be able to determine what voting laws work best for them. What's great for Colorado may not be great for Florida or Georgia or California, or even though California is modeled pretty closely after us. We should trust people in their own states to come up with laws that work for them. Now with that said, I think there's some responsibility that some states should have, not to go too far to where you're unnecessarily restricting access. And so that's something that we should keep an eye on. But by and large, states should be able to determine how they conduct their own elections. And HR 1, there's a lot of problematic aspects to HR 1 that I just wish they'd take a time out and let the states have these conversations.
Ken Blackwell, you were a Secretary of State for Ohio. How would you have liked it if the federal government said, we're going to now dictate how Ohio conducts its elections, and what would your concerns have been?
One, I would have been ticked off because I'm a constitutionalist, and I understand what was the guiding principle of our founders and the framers of our Constitution. It was to make sure that we put a harness on the reach and power and intrusiveness of the federal or central government. And therefore, there was a principle that was used, the principle of subsidiarity, that government that is closest to the people is the government that governs best. And therefore, responsibility for elections, processes, and practices were invested in state legislatures and administered at the local level, at the precinct level, where you had neighbors working with neighbors. And therefore, what you had was a tight ballot chain of custody, and you had a built-in verification system. And so this is a government overreach. This is at the heart of the problem. It would federalize, centralize the election process. And those of us who understand that why we have been the most prosperous, the most diverse constitutional republic in all of human history is because we put a harness on the reach of the federal government.
Yeah.
This would in fact give one party control at the federal level, and that would be a destruction of our federal system.
No two ways about it. Garrett Bess, I know Heritage Action for America has really been one of those organizations leading the charge against HR 1. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, HR 1, I think our principle and what we've been advocating for at the state level is make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. But HR 1 or the S1 Senate component or companion bill would make it easier to cheat and harder to detect, as Senator Roy Blunt put it last week. And so this bill really strips states and of the ability to administer their elections in the way that those states feel works best. I know Matt is from Colorado, and some of those Western states have all mail-in balloting, and that's fine because in the West you have people separated, and there's not necessarily huge population centers, or there's tiny.
It looks like Garrett just cut out for a moment here. Matt Crane, let me ask you about Colorado. When it comes to our state having implemented vote by mail many years ago, I mean, what are a couple of the things that have actually made it work successfully?
Well, the fact, Jimmy, that's a great question. I think the fact that we had a 15-year runway where we went in 1998 to no excuse absentee voting, In about 2005, we went to a permanent mail-in absentee list. In 8 or 9, we started being able to allow to run our primary and coordinated, so our off-year elections by mail. So we had worked over a series of years to be able to grow our processes and mature our processes. So when 1303 passed in 2013, we were already familiar. We had good concepts of chain of custody. We had good concepts of with our voting systems and what it looked like, even though we kept evolving on that. We had already started working towards implementing risk limiting audits. So we had already taken a lot of steps. And I think, for the states that, I mean, if you think about it, it took us 15 years. And in the 2020 election cycle, some states made that move in 180 days.
Right.
And so that's obviously a very condensed timeline to be able to do that. And so, we had calls with states all across the country that were looking to do that and trying to help the best we can. But there's no way that a state can do something in 180 days and do it as well as Colorado does it when we've had 15 years to make that move.
Looks like we got you back, Garrett. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, sorry about that. Having internet connectivity issues over here.
No problem. It happens.
I'm simply saying that, the goal of constitutional conservatives really should be to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. HR 1 S1, to quote Senator Roy Blunt, makes it easier to cheat and harder to detect. There's various things that these bills are intended to do, but all of them revolve around stripping states of their rights and their abilities to institute voting systems that work for them in their state. For example, it mandates same-day registration. There are states that have same-day registration, but not every state necessarily needs same-day registration. It also mandates that that votes be counted whether they're in a particular precinct that they're assigned to or not. It mandates no voter ID laws. So in states that have done, for example, voter ID accompanied with mail-in balloting to make sure that that is a lawfully cast ballot, it would strip away that voter ID requirement and therefore jeopardize that mail-in ballot now.
And that dovetails in then with what's happening at states across the country. Again, we're talking with Garrett Bess, Vice President of Government Relations and Communications at Heritage Action for America, Matt Crane, Executive Director of the Colorado County Clerks Association, and former Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell, who's also co-chair of the board of the International Federation for Election Systems. I want to put up panel 3. This is some of the example of some of the statements that have been leveled against various efforts in states in the country, from Florida to Arkansas to Arizona and Texas and elsewhere, Georgia. And you can see there that Georgia, according to 538, Georgia is hardly the only state that's made it harder to vote. Republican lawmakers have now enacted new voting restrictions in a total of 11 states. The Brennan Center, that's a left-wing think tank, and a backlash to 2020's historic voter turnout, and under the pretense of responding to baseless and racist allegations of voter fraud and election irregularities, state lawmakers have introduced a startling number of bills to curb the vote. You could see some of those phrases there: backlash to a historic voter turnout, racist allegations, curb the vote, new voting restrictions, make it harder to vote. Ken Blackwell, what do you make of those claims, and do you think those are accurate descriptors of what's happening in states around the country?
Well, they're not accurate, and they're acts of desperation by the left. Look, just take HR 1 S1, and they're doing away with, just destroying state requirements for voter ID, meaning that anybody could claim to be anybody they want to be and actually vote. Well, what is racist about a voter ID? We use IDs for everything. If I was going to leave, tickets for you guys at the Cincinnati Reds game, at the will call window, what do you have to show? You have to show an ID. If you want to get on an airplane, you have to show an ID. If you want to take out a library book, you have to show an ID. To now say that it is racist for, in fact, that to be a verification requirement for casting a ballot, because it would in fact enhance voter confidence in the result. It's just stupid on its face.
And Matt Crane, I do want to ask you about voter ID and your take. I mean, you represent Republican and Democrat county clerks in the 64 counties that make Colorado, and I think there are a couple of unaffiliated clerks as well. What is the nature of the game for a state like Colorado when it comes to voter ID and verification, as well as verification of signatures? And how do you think that fits in with some of the legislation being proposed around the country in other states?
So Colorado right now is not a strict photo ID state. So you do have to show some kind of ID, but it can be a utility bill. You know, I'm speaking with my my personal hat on and not my association hat on. You know, when I was clerk and recorder, I always supported photo ID. I think poll after poll shows majority of Americans believe in photo ID, including a majority of people of color. So, you know, to me, this isn't something that really should be as debated as hotly as it is. I mean, in 2014, President Obama said that photo ID wasn't stopping people from voting. It was other things like apathy and lack of education and these types of things. And I agree with that completely. And those are things that we can work with through the process, through voter education campaigns. I think there's a lot that we can do about that. But, you know, the level of conversation right now, as Senator Blackwell said, is that that it's racist or disproportionately impacts people of color. And so that's where the battle lines have been drawn around ID. In Colorado, you know, we have pretty good signature verification processes here, but that doesn't mean we can't get better. One of the things we're going to start pushing for shortly is, you know, consistent and more robust ways that we can audit the work around signature verification to make sure that a judge in Arapahoe County is trained the same at adjudicating signatures the same as somebody in Boulder County or Denver County or Mesa County out on the Western Slope, because it's important that these things are being handled consistently so that we're not creating equal protection issues, so that, you know, a voter in Denver may have their signature examined more harshly or less harshly than a voter in Arapahoe County. So there are good steps in place here in Colorado, but we're constantly working to improve them and to make them better.
Garrett Bess, Heritage Action for America, I know, has been very active in promoting and being involved in these various bills. What do you make of some of the criticisms of, say, Georgia or Florida or Texas, and overall what they're doing? And is there anything that stands out as being particularly important in terms of their efforts?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, people are getting tired of being called racist just simply for believing in basic common sense things such as voter ID laws. I mean, Ken said it great. And I think even Matt referenced some of the polling, like, you know, even in Georgia, something like more than 60% of African-American Georgians actually support voter ID laws. And so this is not something that is targeted at any particular race. It's simply defending all Americans' right and privilege to vote for the elected officials that they choose. I think corporate America, in some sectors, certainly not all of it, but in some areas, really sort of jumped the gun on their criticism of these laws. They face significant backlash, and in many cases, even some of the high-level names that you saw initially come out, laws, particularly in places like Georgia and Texas, have quietly tried to walk those positions back and get back the pushback from conservative grassroots and Americans that support these things has had an effect on the corporations as well.
I want to go to the allegation about racist laws, for example, when it comes to Georgia. And I wrote a column for the Denver Gazette also on how Colorado ends up with Major League Baseball All-Star Game, and I think that's a loss for America. The win for Colorado is a loss for America, in my view, and it doesn't represent or reflect what's actually the case in Georgia. But here, of course, in April, is what President Biden said about Georgia making comparisons to Jim Crow laws.
And so I'm convinced that we'll be able to stop this, because it is the most pernicious thing. This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle. I mean, this is gigantic, what they're trying to do. And it cannot be sustained. And do everything in my power, along with my friends in the House and the Senate, to keep that from becoming the law.
I think, first of all, former Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell, that's way off base. I mean, I'm not aware of poll taxes or poll tests that are in this Georgia law that was recently passed, first of all. Second of all, I think what Republicans and what people who are just in general advocating for some more election integrity are trying to do is strike a balance here between making sure that more people are able to cast votes and also that there isn't, as Garrett said, cheating that's going on, that we can ensure that people who are casting votes are valid voters. What's your take on all that?
Garrett was right. You know, we are all in this to make it easier to vote, harder to cheat. Look, you guys are probably a tad bit younger than I am. And back in the 60s, when I couldn't even vote because the age limit was 21, but I could drive. You know, I was in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I was in Clarksdale, Mississippi. And let me tell you, when a black person would go into a voting booth and would ask, you know, how many jelly beans are in this jar, and if they didn't get the exact number, which they never did, they couldn't vote. To equate, you know, reforms in Georgia and Florida and elsewhere with that sort of practice, you know, again, it's stupid on its face. We in fact have been working to make sure that again we had tight control over the chain of custody of ballots and common sense verification processes. Joe Biden was saying that anything that required a voter ID, whether it's photo or any kind of voter ID, or block the unlimited use of ballot harvesting was racist, you know, shows me that he thinks people are dumb. And that is an insult in and of itself. And that's why he's getting the pushback. And I would imagine that he will have to start walking some of this stuff back, just like Delta, just like Coca-Cola and others.
We're going to wrap up in a moment with our guests, Matt Crane, Ken Blackwell, and Garrett Bess here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Really appreciate your time today. I want to throw up just sort of my summation from a recent Denver Gazette column of what was going on in Georgia. And I think this is very important to put in perspective. To be clear, in Georgia, no excuse mail ballots are still legal. The time window for early voting is longer. Voter ID requirements are now the same for mail ballots as in person. They're claiming that there's some different standards, some tightening of the rules specifically for mail ballots. No, they're simply saying voter ID requirements are going to be the same as for in-person voting. And drop boxes are required, giving voters more places to drop off ballots. Where is this Jim Crow 2.0 exactly? And I think it's important to keep that in perspective. But as we wrap up, I want to ask about striking the balance. Matt Crane first, coming from Colorado as the executive director of the Colorado County Clerks Association. What would you advise in different states as they strike this balance and really need to work together across party lines, as has happened in shaping previous legislation in Colorado to a good extent, in order to make sure that there is that kind of election integrity? And also, what about ballot drop boxes in your view? Because there's a lot of discussion of that, and actually a couple of these bills do seem to address that in ways that may limit where you're able to put them.
So a couple of things. I'll take your second question first and then come back to the more broader question. You know, in Colorado, we've built our model around ballot drop boxes. We feel like it's a pretty secure process for people to be able to return their ballots. We all know our friends at the post office, while they do a great job, their record isn't 100%. So we feel like ballot drop boxes are a more secure and accessible way to make sure that the county gets your ballot. You know, and then when you think about ballot tracks and other tools that we've implemented in Colorado, our friends in Denver started that, but now everybody across the state does it. It allows a lot of transparency around that process so a person can follow their ballot throughout its life cycle. To your first question, Jimmy, I think about the broader conversation of what that looks like. I think we have to start with a place to where we get back to telling the truth. You know, there's been so much mis and disinfo about what happened in 2020. And, you know, when you say that, most people think it comes from the right. And to be sure, there is plenty of mis and disinfo that's come from the right. But when you look at the responses, as we've heard from Ken and Garrett, about what's happening in Georgia and in other states. There's been disinfo about that and misinfo coming from the left too, trying to scare people, trying to scare their base into coming out, and supporting, whatever, policy points they want to, push forward. So we have to get back to a place, and, I know politics, I'm not naive to politics, but we have to get back to a place to where we're speaking more honestly about what's happening, what are the intended impacts of legislation, what does the data say, what does the polling say, like around photo ID, and it's really incumbent, I think, on voters as well, on citizens. If you want to know about what happens in your election process, don't listen to Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity. Call your local election official. Get to know your local election official. Go watch an election. Go serve as an election judge. Participate in the process so that you can learn firsthand. And so you can say, oh, you know what? What I just heard there isn't true. I can tell you this is true. I always told people when I was elected, you can be our best ambassadors to talk about what's real and what's not in this process. And a lot of times when we got people in and we gave them tours of our facility and talked to them, they came away and said, wow, so what I heard here on this station, this radio station, or on that television show isn't true. And it's like, no, it's not true. So really, it's, people have a big ownership stake in this too. Go and visit your election office and learn firsthand what happens.
Garrett Bess, your thoughts on striking the balance. Do you think that states that are advancing election integrity bills are doing that, striking that balance?
Well, I certainly think that this round of election bills that are proceeding through the states or have already proceeded are balanced. The idea that in 2018 ballot drop boxes basically didn't exist in Georgia, then all of a sudden you have a pandemic in which they were all over the place, and then Georgia decides to codify how a ballot box should appear in the context of elections. That is a very balanced and representative way to go about verifying how ballots are submitted.
Garrett, can I just underscore your point that here in Colorado, we have specific, which is hailed as the gold standard across the board. We actually have specific standards in this state on ballot drop boxes, just as Georgia's doing now.
Yeah. I mean, and again, don't quote me exactly on what Georgia's law specifically does with ballot boxes, but if I remember correctly, they simply say they have to be on a county property. Yeah. And so essentially...
And some security precautions need to be taken too.
Yeah, and so, and look, there's a whole conversation we could have about ballot drop boxes and what the left wants to try to do with them. I mean, the left is not, saints in this process. They sure ballot drop boxes occur in precincts in which they think they will get an overwhelming number of votes. It's not that ballot drop boxes in and of themselves are wrong or right. If a state wants to use them, just make sure it's a secure method that you use them. And so I think that Georgia and other states that are contemplating legislation along those lines have been balanced. But then, like what Matt said, the ability to track your ballot through the process and verify when it's counted, I mean, that's a really, really good principle to follow, and that is just transparent. Americans will trust a vote if they lose the vote, if it's a transparent process. What they don't trust is when they can't figure out what happened. They don't have transparency into how the ballots are counted. They don't understand where their ballot went to, and who's responsible for counting it. And whenever you have that, that's a scenario for mistrust in the elections process. And so, transparency methods, those are the things that Americans really all should support. And then we can have a battle of ideas, knowing for sure that the elected results will be true.
And final word to former Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell. Sir, what are your thoughts on striking that balance and where the states are headed?
We have to keep it simple, keep it local, keep it bipartisan. We must be the resistance to this unprecedented power grab to centralize, to federalize the management and the administration of elections. We, in fact, understand very clearly what was at stake when the framers of our Constitution put the harness on the federal government, the central government, to make sure that power stayed with the people. And that is reflected in our election systems and the way they are structured. We can always do better. And that's what we're seeing state after state or reforms that will build voter confidence in the results that are provided by elections. Free
Gentlemen,
and fair
we went
elections.
long and we had there we go. There's the applause for you. We do appreciate your time. Former Ohio Secretary of State Ken Blackwell, also, as I mentioned, board co-chair of the International Federation for Electoral Systems. Matt Crane, executive director of the Colorado County Clerks Association, former clerk for Arapahoe County, and Garrett Bess, Vice President of Government Relations and Communications at Heritage Action for America. I really appreciate your time today joining us to discuss this very important issue. Make no mistake about it. We need to have trust in the process and also make it feasible for people to participate in that process, and striking that balance, I think, is key. Thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy.
Thanks, Jimmy. Appreciate it, sir.
Thank you. Once
Thank
again.
you.
Ken Blackwell, Matt Crane, and Garrett Bess all joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads today. And let's just be clear about something. Striking that balance and having that bipartisan approach is crucial. We do need the states across this country to make sure that they are approaching this in a way that has the people of their states in mind, and that doesn't simply get caught up in political jargon or ideas like, okay, we've got voter suppression, or we've got this, or we've got that. We need to have a serious conversation about this, which is why I thought having different voices on the program made sense. And, Ken Blackwell talking about federalism. That's fundamental to our system of government and the Constitution altogether here in the United States of America. And it, without question, should be applied to our election systems. Going to the points made by Matt Crane about it taking 15 years to get to the point here in Colorado, where he and I both are, where we could switch to vote by mail. Then you had years of changes and tweaks to the system. You can't make those kind of tweaks to the system if the all-knowing, all-powerful federal government comes in with something like H.R. 1 or S1 and says, this is how you're going to do it. That's what I mean by striking the balance. A, making sure that the states are able to do what they want to do in their systems to ensure election integrity and access to the vote. But we also need to make sure that when we are approaching these discussions in various states, that you are, as Matt Crane said, talking about the facts, talking about the details, getting into the specifics. And Garrett Bess was also emphasizing the point that certain policies and certain efforts will be better in one state or another state. You need to have that kind of flexibility, and you need to be focused on what's the best way to actually make sure that we can have confidence in the vote and that people can get to the polls. And I do agree that both sides are missing the mark to some extent on that, oftentimes in the discussion. But I think these bills are mostly on point in that regard. Certainly the bill in Georgia is one that I feel very confident in saying seems quite good on the whole. And certainly not meriting removing, I think $190 million in economic benefits to Atlanta to come here to Denver in the name of racial justice or something. There are a lot more people in the black community in Atlanta than here in Colorado. What's that about? Is that really advancing some sort of racial justice cause? I don't think so. Let's be honest, let's be open, and let's have integrity in this discussion and approach it in a way that does justice to our republic and to its citizens. That is it for us today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. My thanks to all of our guests, Dr. John Eastman, Randy Corporon, the Honorable Ken Blackwell, the Honorable Matt Crane, and Garrett Bess. Also, my thanks to producer extraordinaire Nathan Matus, to our partners at the Washington Examiner, and most especially to you for watching, subscribing, sharing, and engaging with our content. What do you think of our conversations today? Please comment below. Look forward to engaging in that conversation with you. Have a great day. We'll be back next Monday with more engaging, intelligent talk, making sense out of nonsense. In the meantime, may God bless America.
Talking politics, great for generations. Oh, what a mix. I got Jimmy at the crossroads. making sense out of nonsense. Yeah.